think we just have to start with a note about the murder of George Floyd by police officers, and as a sign and an indication of how troubled our society is, how easy it is for us to have all been so distracted by the seriousness of this pandemic that we forget that as life goes on, some of the worst things are continuing to happen in this country over and over and over again. That said, Brad, I'm going to start by interviewing you. And the question is, how did a nice Jewish boy get into politics? Or more to the point, really, how do you think about these issues? How do you connect your Judaism, whatever brands of Judaism are important to you, with your work as an activist and advocate and an elected official?
First, let me say it's really nice to be here. I have not gotten to celebrate Shavuot on the Upper West Side before, and Zoom makes a set of things possible and easier. So it's nice to be here with all of you, and especially nice to be here with Ruth. Ruth and I are doing a weekly show on sort of justice in action in the era of COVID, and we'll share the links on that later. And I appreciate your starting, Ruth, with just grounding us in the reality of systemic racism and white supremacy that we know we live in, but it's easy to forget. And when something like that murder happens, what happens in Central Park happens, our attention's called to it. So thank you. It's interesting for me because it really is true for me that it is my Jewish upbringing, kind of grounded in a set of communities and traditions that connect Judaism to social justice, that have shaped my whole life and career. In high school, both at Jewish summer camp, but especially through the Reformed Jewish Youth Movement, I was the social action vice president of what they now call the Missouri Valley region of the North American Federation of Temple Youth. At the time, we called it MAFTI. And that was where, in the ways that kids do at camp and in youth group, the grounding ideals in, the Pirkei Avot quotes and the Torah teaching on social justice and the fun of doing it together with like other young Jews, inspired by folks who had come before us, really led me to the idea of being active in liberal social justice as a high school kid. Now, that was really troubled in some ways as soon as I got to campus. I got to campus in the fall of 1987 as the first Intifada was breaking out. And I thought I had this whole set of teachings about Jews as liberal social justice activists, and I had not been taught anything about the Israel-Palestine conflict and the human rights and dignity of Palestinians. And I was just kind of like floored by it. And it was part of a kind of a radicalizing experience of like, you have to ask a lot of questions of your liberal upbringing to try to understand what's going on. And that led me to, actually one fun story, that led me in my freshman fall at the University of Chicago to join Democratic Socialists of America. And what I heard was like, we have a lot of elected officials, very famous ones that are DSA members. And I'm like, oh, who? And they're like, oh, the borough president of Manhattan. She's a very famous DSA member. And that was my first encounter with Ruth Messenger. And really from that time, I was excited to meet you. I then went to London after college, after graduating from college, and the crew I fell in with there was actually in London called the Jewish Socialist Group, Bundists really, or neo-Bundists, who were doing anti-racist and work in London at that time. And when I got to New York after that, I connected with Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, joined my current synagogue, Kolot Chayenu, actually first met my rabbi, Ellen Lippman, because she was the leader of Mazon, found you. But I will just say, like, all along the way, it was both the set of grounding values and the sense of community that you do it together. And really, I have to say, kind of a grounding in both those just like core liberal values, but also in the radical spirit that tries hard to demand that you live up to them. And I really think that is in some ways, for me, the deepest challenge. And I'm feeling it tonight because it's like easy to talk about the importance of racial justice and hard to grapple with the reality of what white privilege looks like. And, you know, I've been talking a lot over the last couple of days with my Black colleagues in the council. And, you know, they are in a kind of agony that I can see but not really truthfully understand in a very deep way. And I think they appreciate the solidarity, and I know they appreciate the kind of allyship. But I really do think part of the tension I feel in kind of balancing, like we've got this great set of quotes and great set of values and great set of traditions and great set of heroes and leaders who have fought for them all this time. And sometimes our liberal Jewish social justice worlds on the Upper West Side and for sure in Park Slope have a kind of comfort about them, you know, and I think that kind of ideal is actually a Christian rather than a Jew that went with that sort of idea of comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. But it is a core idea that I have tried to make part of my social justice activism, to translate effectively into public office, which we'll talk a little more about. That's not always easy because you've got to be pragmatic and build genuine coalitions to get things done. And I know you know that, and we'll talk a little more about it. But that has just been for me, as much as anything, a real Jewish understanding of like what the obligations are of being a person, of being an activist, and of being an elected official. I wonder if you'll share the same thing. Obviously, you know, you've got also a kind of remarkable trajectory, and you've been back and forth between electoral politics and activism a lot of times, in both explicitly Jewish organizations like the Amazing American Jewish World Service, as well as in politics. You know, and how much of that for you has been Jewish and how much has been political, and how do those things relate to each other?
Okay, I'm going to try to be brief because my life is too long, and if I told all the stories, we'd be here forever. Also want to note that in our audience is David Kaufman, who's a distinguished American Jewish historian, and the first time he heard me speak about myself, I will mention my grandfather, but I want to say, Brad, it's interesting because in some ways it's very similar and in some ways it's different. The difference is that I never connected to any of the youth group, youth movement, camp in the Jewish community that so shaped so many of the Jewish progressives that I work with today of all generations, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I was raised in a family, starting indeed with my grandfather, who was serious about Jewish obligation to give back, was actually the first executive director of Federation in New York. And his daughter, my mother, worked at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And so I was raised just with the notion that what Judaism is all about is giving back, taking care of the other, standing up for justice, crossing racial lines, which was a very different issue in my early years than it is, because it was a different time. But that's just, I connected that with being Jewish. I connected being Jewish with having those issues and concerns. And I saw perfectly naturally my trajectory out of college into graduate school and social work, exploring casework, deciding I was not meant to be a caseworker, and being attracted to community organizing almost before it was a field. And just working for social change for a long time on the West Side, which then inspired me to run for office. But for me, the through line all the way along was like, this is what I do because I'm Jewish. And so what I was always interested in was the number of Jews who didn't seem to think that social justice should be the dominant concern in their lives. And also, and maybe more importantly, the lack of understanding of Jews as a people committed to social justice, because you meet lots of people who in America, you meet lots of people who know Jews and don't think that that's what we're about. And where I had the privilege of working with American Jewish World Service around the world, you meet lots of people who don't know any Jews and know one or two things about Judaism, and it's certainly not that Jews are a people committed to social justice. So I think for me, it's like these two things are so inextricable. And when we started doing the radio program together or the webinar program together, and we've known each other and we keep talking about these things, but I just thought it was worth sort of exploring it a little bit with each other. And then with everyone else. You raised one issue which I'd love to talk about, and then you can fire other questions at me and I will at you. And that is the connection between being inside and outside. So being an activist and an organizer and an advocate, and then being in elected office, and then in my case, being out of elected office and going back to organizing. And for me, it's absolutely critical that there have to be both pieces. And the best story about this, which is either a true story or apocryphal, I have no idea, but it's a story about FDR, who, you know, when the country was in a great deal of trouble, was visited supposedly by a large number of activists, including union activists and social change agents, who said basically, here's our agenda for you, for your term, for your presidency. And he is reported to have said, that's fine, now go out there and make me do it. Which is a way of saying that people in elected office depend hugely, and I can't tell you how true that was in my early years on the city council, on having activists. In my case, when I was on this last statement I'll make, when I was on the city council, when I was first elected to the city council in whatever year that was, 1977, we had 2 staff people. And so in order to establish the reputation that I'm proud to say I established of driving commissioners crazy and driving mayors crazy and always asking questions, half my work, probably 3/4 of my work, was done by activist groups. I mean, I could call people up and say, I'm going to go talk to this commissioner, this is going to happen in the city council, and people would give me and my staff the information we needed to do the job. But at the same time, those activists outside would then, as you said rightly, sometimes be angry at me because I was saying the best I could do was compromise. And they always held out the standard for pushing further. So I just want to say clearly, you need both. And for people in this audience today, we'd love to hear who you are and get your questions. But I want to say that you're probably given to advocacy. I hope you see the Jewish connection to advocacy, but I also hope that some of you think from time to time about running for office or supporting people in office, because we need people in both places.
Yeah, and you know, it's one nice thing since 2018, you know, having this sort of younger activist set of elected officials, I think helps people connect to that idea. One thing I've actually liked is that some of the young people who are really at the kind of left edge of politics, of activist life right now, you know, they're out in the streets against immigrant detention and against police brutality, and but they're much less totally like keep away from me with electoral politics than I feel like I've seen in some past generations. And I think that's a really good thing. I mean, to me, all meaningful social change like comes at that dynamic. If there is not the building of power from outside groups who are organizing people on the ground through unions, through community organizations, through the civil rights movement, through the women's rights movement, through LGBT equality, like that's what changes what's expected. But unless government can then be connected to deliver and see some change happen, you know, things get stuck. And, you know, it's easy when you're in elected office to kind of think, oh, change happens in elected office. And I think the kinds of people who run, I mean, I sometimes say, you know, like there's elected office attracts people who, like, if you're going to go be the one to just knock on the door every time and say, knock, 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 me, like it attracts a set of people who are desperate for ego gratification, basically. And so it becomes, you know, you definitely have a set of people who therefore think that's how change happens. But you know, it is in that dynamic of inside and outside. And I've heard some people using terms like co-governance to think about more deeply about the relationship between the organizing work and the governing work. And I have found that to be the kind of richest dynamic. It's hard sometimes because, of course, people want much more change than, you know, you can usually deliver through even what seems like the edgiest law or the, you know, new program you can fund, and you're moving, you know, your council or, you know, as far as you possibly can, and it's still way less than your advocates want you to go. And one tool that I kind of learned in that is thinking about the difference between sort of transactional change and transformational change. And it's not always easy to tell the difference because folks have organized, they've built a lot of power, they had a big set of demands. And then you get in the room, there's a time comes to kind of cut the deal, figure out just how much you can get. it is rarely as much as people wanted as they began the campaign. It's usually way more than the folks inside thought that the system would ever do, whether that's on living wage or affordable housing or police reform. And the question is sort of at the end of the day, when that deal gets cut, do people leave feeling like, gee, that was gross? Like we won something, but I don't like how it happened and I don't want to kind of get back into it? Or do they leave feeling like we built some power, we built some relationships we'd want to work on again, we're going to claim this victory, maybe we'll just like go have a beer, and then we'll get back to work together.
Right.
If
But
you
I
can
think,
get that dynamic going, then you can really build something effective.
so just one comment on that, and that is, I think that something that has changed immensely since the time that I first entered politics has been the increased level of transparency about that. It's no fun when you come to lobby, and I remember this from long before I was in office, when you go to lobby an elected official and you say, here are our demands, and then they disappear. And they come back 2 months later and say, oh, well, we worked really hard in Albany and we won you this, we won you with 1 point on a star. Sorry, we didn't give you the sun, the moon, and the stars. And you don't have any idea whether they ever represented you honestly or not. And they don't even have any idea whether they fought for you. And now what you're describing, what I work on in all contexts, is to be absolutely clear with the outside activists where the ultimate decision-making power lies and what actually happens inside some of those rooms and what it's like to see how much you can win. So I just want to take a step back and say, we both talked about this as, for each of us, as inherently part of our Judaism. And I want to add to that without making this a Torah teaching session, just to say that from my point of view, Jewish text speaks to this clearly all of the time. What does it mean to pursue justice? What I love most about that, everybody understands their own vision of justice. What I love most about that is that it says pursue. Pursue is a process. It means active work. That's what we're really being told to do. You're not going to win it all. You're going to keep working at it. And over again, I think there is clear Jewish text that says study is important only because it leads to action. That you have to pursue the goal and that you have to work on behalf of all people, because people are equally made in the image of whatever it is you think makes that image. So there's an obligation to be working for racial justice, for LGBTI rights, for ending some of the worst inequities that exist in this country. And that's, for me, that's where I come at all of this. And I want to ask you one other question, and then maybe we should move to open it up. And I just wanted to ask you, in your experience in the city of New York, with your colleagues, you were talking a few minutes ago about your colleagues of color working on solidarity around some race issues. When you go speak in your district, when you're visibly in places where there are not a lot of Jews, two questions. One is, how often or consciously do you reference the fact that you are Jewish and that your Judaism tells you to work for social justice? That's one question. And the other question is, how do you think, and this is obviously too broad a question, but in general, how do you think people perceive Jews and what their issues are?
That's a great question. And I might ask you to reflect on the second part of it as well, because, well, to the first, I'll say I do it a lot. I mean, partly I feel it, like, I think it's just genuine for me. And I think it's, I'm kind of a over intellectual, wonky, policy oriented politician, but any good political consultant will tell you, just like tell your story. Don't go into all those details, Brad. And, our stories are grounded in who we are. So it really is, when I'm coming back to trying to make connections with people, that's how I do it. And I find that people really appreciate and value that, even where those communities have tension. That's true with Muslim communities, it's true with Black communities, it's true. So I mean, sometimes that looks more like bringing some line of Torah or some teaching, but more it's just kind of grounding that, like, this is who I am and how I come to this issue. And obviously that's not how we make the decisions. But I do it a lot, and certainly much more in elected office than I did as an affordable housing activist. Like in my 15-year career as an affordable housing activist, I don't think I brought my Judaism with me as much as I might if I were doing it again. But in a body as diverse as the council, you know, I find, and part of what's interesting about that is, and this gets to your second question, people find it surprising because in New York City politics, when people show up wearing their Judaism on their sleeve, they tend to have conservative politics. And I think a really interesting challenge in the city at this moment is for everybody on this call, I would think, and like mostly the folks on the Upper West Side and in Park Slope, it's pretty clear that Jewish teaching and tradition and history and socioeconomic position and like a whole set of understandings, like in our bones to show up in social justice fights. Like we know it from our position, we learn it from our texts, like it just seems obvious. And yet, if you're looking in political space in New York City, the set of folks bringing Jewish tradition to the table, wearing Jewish clothing and showing up visibly as Jews are, you know, Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews. And I got plenty of Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox friends, but who have a very conservative politics, some like fully Trump supporting and some not Trump supporting, but still quite conservative, kind of conservative Democrats. And I wrestle. And so partly when I show up as a, you know, as a progressive with deeply Jewish values and traditions, I think people really appreciate it, who are allies. And, but they are also, I don't want to say puzzled by it, but a little surprised by it. And that makes me sad just because I want people to know our history and tradition, but I'm also grappling with it a lot, like trying to understand where that comes from. You know, I love our whole people. Like I've liked learning and meeting and getting to know people in from communities, and I feel a kinship, a kind of sense of being cousins. And yet I also feel just like an enormous, you know, sense like our country's got to be on a different path, and Israel's got to be on a different path, and our people have to be on a different path if we're going to live our values. And that's complicated. And I will just offer one kind of funny thing here that I have to say did help me a little bit. I don't know if how many people like me use some of their pandemic time to watch Unorthodox. But my favorite, the scene that I found most like useful was the Passover Seder. Because if you had asked me before, like, you know, I would have said like, of course the Passover Seder teaches, like our whole Passover Seder is like a liberation Haggadah. You know, it's a pretty simple story. Like we were slaves and now we're free. So anybody else who's slaves, we got to be on the side of fighting for their freedom, duh. And to watch the Seder understood as in every generation, they will rise up to destroy us. So we best defend ourselves before they do. And see like just how deeply, like you could take our tradition and understand that just that deeply. And that is how Judaism actually shows up in the city council more often than the version that we are teaching. Part of it's just because like it shows up in people who are wearing, you know, who have payas and who are wearing kippot or streimels. And, you know, I continue to find that one of the real challenges of elected life. And I wonder, Ruth, you know, dealing with that as a woman, I think is even more challenging. I just wonder how much of that you've dealt with and kind of what your perspective is on it. And let's open it up.
Well, I don't think I can't get into the whole gender thing now, but I will say that this has been, I mean, for me, this has been you know, a nonstop cause. It happened because early in my life, on one of my formative experiences, as I ended up, don't ask for any details, living and working in rural Western Oklahoma, where literally nobody had ever seen or heard or met a Jew, but they knew we had horns. They actually knew that we killed Christ. Anyway, so I was just dealing with Judaism, with all of these things nonstop for 2 years. And that was a place where I realized that it's important to tell people who are meeting me that aspect of me, which they can't see, but which is a useful way of helping them understand at least what I believe Judaism to be all about. So I really started doing it early in my career. I did it on the West Side. And then it was a dramatic issue in the life of American Jewish World Service, because many of the people that we work with in this country, organizing on advocacy issues like, you know, different kinds of foreign aid, stopping a genocide in Burma, whatever, we have consistently trained our donors and supporters, and particularly rabbis, to work with us on on Washington, D.C. advocacy on global human rights. And until people get there, they don't believe me, but it is a fact that the vast majority of non-Jewish members of Congress, all of whom represent Jews, and some of whom represent lots of Jews, actually believe Jews to be only concerned about Israel. And that doesn't even, I'm not even saying just a single position on Israel, because yes, they hear a lot from AIPAC, that they also hear from J Street, they also hear, but they think that that's what the Jews in their constituencies are interested in, which many of them are, but they don't see Jews as being involved in the movements for civil rights and social justice and racial justice. And our famous funny story about this was about 10 years ago, we spent a lot of time, for good reason, lobbying to improve the renewal of the United States Farm Bill, which has to do with all kinds of foreign food aid. And we would call offices and say we were bringing a delegation of rabbis from American Jewish World Service to talk about the Farm Bill. And unless I spelled it, literally spelled it, they would assume that I didn't speak English very well, but that I was talking about foreign aid bill. And so they would assemble their foreign aid experts to come meet with this group of rabbis who wanted to talk about the Farm Bill. And I used to have these long discussions saying, no, farm, F-A-R-M. Your congressperson is on the agriculture committee, and that's why we want to come and talk to you. But I did eventually convince a lot of people that we're not seen as being the people that I think we are. So
Ruth,
we're not going to get into the gender issues. Yeah.
That leads into a great question that we have for you guys in the chat that was sent to me. So Brad, the council, I'm reading the note, the council created a policy a few years ago that you can create bills, that you cannot create bills to promote places outside the US. Are you often confronted by obstacles related to being Jewish and the connection to Israel?
Interesting. Well, that's two. I have to say, I think the council decision not to pass resolutions about foreign policy was a wise policy for the city council, because resolutions, like even when we pass resolutions like about state legislation, which you know, the state legislators don't read our resolutions and don't care that much, you know, usually what we think about their bills. So resolutions is like laws the council passes become the laws of New York City. And resolutions are like, we think this, then you could just say it. And there was a period of time when the council got very into passing resolutions about foreign policy and just spent an enormous amount of time on it that I don't think was that valuable. But that doesn't mean that I don't wind up talking about Israel and Palestine a lot. And I will be honest, and I wrote about this a year and a half ago or so, I spent most of my 10 years in office doing everything I could to keep my mouth zipped up tight. Like what I learned was kind of whatever you say, people are going to be mad at you. I can't do anything about it, you know, and so I just didn't speak about it. And that was like bad for me psychologically because I care a lot about it, and it like felt like a form of repression to not talk about it, even though it's like banging around in my head. And I also concluded it was really bad politics too, because like people know when you're not being honest. And so I started, I don't know, yeah, I think it's like a year and a half or maybe even 2 years ago now. It actually came after an event that I got invited to that J Street and New Israel Fund hosted, of both American progressives and Israeli progressives, including Palestinian citizens of Israel. And we went on a retreat at the old Rockefeller estate at the Pocantico Center. And, you know, it just enabled me to speak my politics, which are, you know, pretty much just kind of a, you know, left half of J Street politics. You know, I think probably like a lot of people, but not everybody, you know, on this call, like I'm a big believer and find a lot of personal connection in Israel's right to exist as a Jewish and democratic state, but believe it would have to exist as a Jewish and democratic state for that to be real, and that not speaking honestly about the dignity and human rights and right to self-determination of Palestinians and what is preventing that, and speaking about the ways in which, like, I don't like BDS because it denies, Jewish self-determination. But I hate the occupation for what it is doing, primarily to Palestinians, but also to Israel and to Jews. So that's just honest. Not everyone has to agree with that point of view. I love people to my left and I love people to my right on that set of issues. But like finding that you couldn't talk about it, was just killing me. So I guess I'm running an experiment. Next year, I'm going to be running citywide, and we'll see whether you can talk like that or not and get elected. But I just concluded that the other strategy of like just zipping my mouth up on things I care passionately about wasn't going to work. So that's the strategy that I'm adopting on those issues, and I welcome feedback on it.
Ruth, I have a question for you, if it's okay.
Sure.
So Ruth, as a Democrat and a former head of a 501c3 that cannot endorse or promote politicians, but rather just policy, how did you walk that fine line?
First of all, so personally, that was an issue that I raised early on with the board of the American Jewish World Service, because the organization cannot, if it wants to, any 501c3 that wants to keep its tax exempt status cannot engage in partisan politics supporting elected officials. And because I came to American Jewish World Service literally at the end of a campaign, of a citywide campaign, which I lost, I was, known for caring a lot about democratic politics, and I went out of my way for a couple of years to, to write checks to candidates that I cared about, but not to show up on lots and lots of platforms. But after a couple of years, frankly, I think because American Jewish World Service had become hugely successful, I said to the board, so it's not so different from what Brad was just talking about, but it was a little more complicated line. I just said to the board, look, my politics are known in this city. I'm not ever going to do anything that suggests that AJWS is supporting a candidate. But when there's a citywide election, I'm going to endorse people and I'm going to, show up and speak for some people. And I think that the electorate that I know and love will be able to keep it straight. And so I did some of that. More to the point, Tess, I think, is to help people understand that organizations, including many that people here are a part of, including the JCC, cannot endorse candidates, but can get hugely involved in nonpartisan political activity. There's people confuse the notion that you can't be partisan with the notion that you can't be political. So it is political to see that every single person on the West Side, in Manhattan and in the city of New York completes the census form. It directly defines how much representation we will have and how much federal money we will get. It is critical that everyone on this call understand the number of efforts around the country, not so much in New York, but the number of efforts around the country to specifically suppress voting, purge voters from the rolls. And that means that we have to do our part in New York to maximize people being registered, knowing how to find out who's on the ballot, and going to the polls. And as long as we don't ever talk to them about who they're voting for, that is nonpartisan political activity. And it's the work that's carried on. It's the central work of Brad and I did a program on voting rights on this webinar. And we hosted Susan Lerner, who's the head of Common Cause. It is the work of Common Cause. It is the work of other organizations. So I think I'm much more interested in, I will always respect a line that's laid out as to what I can and can't do. And because of my various roles in not-for-profit organizations, I have always and often talked to board chairs, worked out what I can and can't do as an individual. But I think that should not be the point. The point for this audience should be like, there's a vast amount of critically important activism that is sanctioned and endorsed by not-for-profit organizations that is not partisan. And that's where people need to be putting those energies. And then on another people are obviously free to go work for candidates, but not under the cover of an organization. And that's a line that everybody can really figure out and should figure out.
I have another question. Is this a good time?
Sure. And if
Okay.
anybody wants to ask their own questions, they can. They have another something minutes.
Well, they
15
can.
minutes.
This one was sent in.
Okay, go ahead.
So, as someone who's interested in getting involved in electoral politics, I'm often turned off by the way the media can attack politicians in a personal way. How did you manage that, and what would you say to still encourage people to run for office despite that?
Life is tough. That's what I'd say. I mean, for sure. That's a fantastic question. We all engage. The media worse than anybody, but too many people in public office and too many people running for public office engage in personal attacks on the opposition. If we continue over a long period of time to treat all elected officials or all politicians with contempt, we will end up with contemptible politicians, because it does discourage people from going into this line of work. But you know what? There are downsides to every line of work. And I think it's critically important for people to understand, yes, that's a piece of what comes with the territory. But you know what? It's not all of it. And it's something you can really rise above reasonably quickly. Sometimes it's not fun. Being engaged in a serious debate on an issue can also be tough. Holding your own against Donald Trump, the developer, which I did many times before he was who he is now, can be tough. By the way, he was always given to telling people they were lying and making up their facts. And he's been doing that for a very long time. But there are attacks. The media is given, in general, the media is a little bit too given to covering bad news rather than good news. And they are very given to covering elected officials from a kind of gotcha perspective. Unfortunately, sometimes it's understandable why they do that, because sometimes elected officials or people running for office say one thing and live a very different and act very differently. And so the media sees it as their job to expose it. But I don't want to deny that it's there. I just want to say, please, and this is where I want to end up, whoever put that question in, please go into elected office anyway. Please get involved in electoral politics. Please just see that as a downside. There are downsides to anything that any avenue of work you might choose. That is an aspect, that is a downside, but there's a huge upside to being in electoral politics, to having the kinds of opportunities that Brad and I were talking about, to influence and shape policy, to work with outside activist groups, to see what you can and can't win, and to just understand in your mind the difference between partisan activity and running for office, which I encourage all of you to do. I also, by the way, would encourage everyone, and this is a political statement covered by the topic that we're discussing here, on your own, go and work for a candidate, because then you understand much more about some of what Brad was talking about. What's it like to talk to 27 audiences in a week and try to be true to yourself and what you believe in, and deal with people attacking you or questioning you or disagreeing with you. What is it like to actually be able to convince people to get involved electorally? And so it's a campaign work is critically important, even if you're not going to run for office yourself. But if you're thinking of running for office, please get involved and do it.
And I'll just add two things. I agree with everything Ruth said. And, you know, like, yes, you shouldn't run for office if you're going to like mind when you get attacked, but you get so much more benefit and opportunity. But like two things that have helped me a lot. One, I try to approach politics as a team sport. Most people play it as an individual sport. It looks like an individual sport. Most elected officials are kind of out to advance their own career. And the more you can think, if you're doing that inside-outside work, it means you build up relationships with all kinds of organizations and activists. And sometimes you got a core group, you know, a political club, or for me, the Working Families Party has served that function. But it's a much bigger team. Like, you're there for a set of values. You know who the people are that share them. You've been in foxholes with them. And like, they will tell you when you're full of shit or when you did the wrong thing. And they will also tell you when the criticism that's coming is like nonsense. And it's a lot, you know, so like when criticism is coming, whatever, when the New York Post takes a cheap shot at me and I don't like it, you know, I got a set of people that are like, Brad, buck up, you know, like you came to do this and you decided on this one, you were going to be the one that was out front. And like that was coming. And then the second thing which can go with that is you got to have some people in your life who can be honest with you. I learned this, you know, term that, from my rabbi that you want relationships of tochecha, of like loving, rebuke, people who can, you count on, because a lot of people, once you're in a position of elected life, will tell you what you want to hear. And having some people you trust who can be really honest with you when you screw up, but in ways that feel like loving and helpful and supportive. If you could get those things, and like, that's really what a great rabbi should do for you. So like, get yourself a rabbi who can deliver you tochecha, and then like, and a good team of people that you build relationships with up over time. And then like, you could go out in the fray and have people say all kinds of things about you. And you got some place to come back to where there's people who have your back, but also people who can be honest with you about when you screw up, because you're going to do that too. And I don't know, those relationships have just been extraordinary blessings.
Really well said.
This
And
is a
really
great
true in
question.
campaigns.
Sorry, go ahead, Ruth.
No, I was just going to say, and very true in campaigns. It's one thing to be in elected office and have some ups and downs. When you're in a campaign, you really need a team of people who will have your back and criticize you and support you. It's critical.
So a question that we just got is, I'm a newly ordained cantor. What can Jewish clergy do to best support the kind of work you're doing? I'm involved in community organizing and wondering how to effectively do it within a congregation.
Mazel tov, first of all, on your ordination, and second of all, a bigger mazel tov on your not your ordination, but your orientation towards social justice. And I think the answer there is that's actually something all over the country, and I can say that with some passion because it's part of my work, that rabbis, cantors, and Jewish educators are exploring. They embrace the idea of social justice, activism, advocacy at different levels. So you have to pay attention to the place you're working, just like Brad and I were saying that being in the inside room when the budget is carved up isn't always as blissful as being on the outside and demanding what you want. Being in a work setting, you have to find out, like, what are the parameters of the place where you work? What's their orientation, of synagogue in this case, or a Hebrew school or a day school, toward social justice and advocacy? And if it exists, how can you fit into it? And if it doesn't exist, how can you help build to it? For me, the simplest step is that most congregations that I know are really keen and strong on mitzvah days, mitzvah programs for bar and bat mitzvah students, where people are picking an issue or picking something they care about and spending time there, or sometimes a requirement for B'nai Mitzvah kids, but giving time, giving thought, giving service. And I am a huge supporter of those efforts. But I think it behooves the teachers, and in this case I see a cantor as a teacher, to find the places to help ask why the situation is what it is. If you're going to work at a soup kitchen one night a week for a year, you should take some time with supportive adults to think about why people are hungry. Right now, the estimate in New York is, I think Brad will back me up, is that we have 1 million new New Yorkers newly hungry. We had about 1 million New Yorkers who, combination of their circumstance, didn't have enough to eat. We now probably have 1 million more because of the impact of the pandemic. So the first thing to do is look for ways and places to feed them, whether that's advocacy for an expanded federal assistance or city programs or whatever. There's 1,000 answers to this question. But at some point, when people are doing food service work, you want to ask exactly, why are people hungry? Is it that the SNAP program isn't generous enough? Is it that people don't know about the SNAP program? Is it that there's a piece of advocacy which a congregation could do, again, totally nonpartisan, that just says, we think this is a law that should be changed. But that's an exploratory process in the setting where you're going to be working. And I just think that learning to ask the question, to value service projects and mitzvah projects, but to ask why, is very powerful. I just got a letter literally today from a 14-year-old who was bar mitzvah in my synagogue last year, who wrote me a note, actually didn't even email me, wrote me a note on a card and said, when you have time, can you tell me how I could work to help be sure that more people vote in November? So, you know, and we want to encourage kids like that, not say to them, sorry, that's not something that happens here. So I think it's a fantastic question, and I'd be delighted to talk to this new cantor offline anytime.
And I'll say I've seen a bunch of models of this, and I think there's a lot of ways to do it. It's the rabbi that did my officiated my bar mitzvah, Susan Talde, was one of the first women rabbis, amazing rabbi in St. Louis.
An American Jewish World Service fellow. Thank you.
And and then my rabbi in college was Arnold Jacob Wolf, who was Obama's rabbi, like a prophetic troll. Rest in peace, Arnie Wolf. And Ellen Littman has been my lifelong rabbi. We've got a great new rabbi, Miriam Grossman. And I joke sometimes that I don't really believe in God, but I cannot explain all the rabbis that she keeps sending me. And there've been a lot of different forms of social justice. Like Arnie was like a prophet. He was not an organizer. He just told you what he thought the truth was and expected you to hear it. And then I've got folks who are more like organizers and build relationships within their synagogue and help people find their power together. I think that's the model that people kind of like these days, of being an organizer within your congregation, getting to know people, know what motivates them, so you can help move people together like a good organizer does. And then I just would remember the thing that Ruth and I said about how valuable it is to show up as progressive Jews on issues. And there's just so much less of it, especially in somewhat more issue electoral space than you would think, given how you know what we feel. But the number of progressive Jews who show up with their congregation, with their rabbi or cantor at City Hall on an issue or in the state legislature is tiny. It is. So there's a number of organizations that are doing this now. I see Matt Nosenchuk is with us here tonight. He's leading a new effort, New York Jewish Agenda, that Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum and Rachel Pomoner and I and some others are in, kind of a liberal Jewish kind of grasstops organization on a range of issues. I mentioned Jews for Racial and Economic Justice before. They've got a rabbinic council, have been central allies on police reform and housing justice, bunch of issues. AJWS for sure, and TRUA are all places that TRUA is honoring Ellen Littman, I think, next week. So those organizations all not just have good resources, but are in organizing communities.
Right. I want to add to that, because there were, for this cantor, so a huge number of congregations and families support Mazon, and Mazon is known for being about feeding hungry people, and they have a practice that encourages people who are doing simchas, synagogue events, to give some of the money that they're spending on their caterer and their florist and whatever to Mazon to feed hungry people. But Mazon is a great example of what I was talking about before. They run concrete service programs, and they are also fierce about advocacy and looking where to change federal and local laws so that they won't have to feed quite so many people. You cannot feed the whole 2 million people in New York who are hungry without supporting government actions to help feed people. So I think these are great issues for all of you, not just the newly ordained cantor, to take into synagogue or temple life where you're active, and just see what is being done and how it's being done, and to be sure that it's done smartly, because you want it to be effective.
Ruth Tess says we have one last question and 1 minute, so we're going to
We
try
have
to
1
squeeze
minute,
this
so
in.
each
All
of you give me one answer to this question very quickly. This person is curious if you have any advice how they, as a white Jewish person, can help somehow with all the terrible racist things going on right now with the police and people of color. If you guys can give one suggestion, one way for a person to educate themselves or take action.
There are so many. I would be delighted to really hear from you offline and urge you to get involved with the group and urge you to talk about it. That's why, actually, I hope you were on at the beginning of the program. That's why I took the first 30 seconds to talk about George Floyd, because we can't keep walking in and out of spaces as white people and not acknowledge what's happening elsewhere in the world. But there are serious and not overwhelmingly heavy places to go, articles to read. Somebody just sent out from the Center for Social Responsibility, which is in a way sponsoring this presentation, 75 things that white people can do on these issues. So please do not drop that question. Any of you, just get in touch with Tess at the Center for Social Responsibility at the JCC, and she will line up your questions and we will get back to all of you. This is really important work. Brad?
And I'll just say here on policing in particular in New York City, there's an amazing coalition, Communities United for Police Reform, that has been at this work for a long time with families of people who've been killed in police violence, pushing right now on campaigns to make sure the NYPD is not involved in social distancing enforcement and is not exempt from the hard budget decisions we're going to have to make. And I can't tell you how proud it makes me that Jews for Racial and Economic Justice is a longtime core partner of Communities United for Police Reform. It makes an enormous difference. And at the moment, that's the place I would start in here.